Hi, my name is Michael Eggebrecht, and this is Craft Baking Edge. Today, we're covering designing a bakery and also getting into the pounds of dough per square foot a bakery can anticipate to produce in their production area. So stay tuned. So, designing a bakery starts long before you start selecting your ovens and mixers for the space. You have to understand your product categories and what goes into those and what equipment you will need. And then ultimately, we need to start with the amount of space that you have available for your production to size it accordingly. I want to go through the common areas of production that everyone will need for designing a bakery, and that starts at receiving and storage. So, receiving and storage basically is what it says. Ingredients coming in, let's say the back door, it's going into a dry storage or walk in coolers to house the dairy products and other items that you will be keeping on hand for a period of time, whether it's a once per week delivery or a couple times per week. The size of your storage will dictate how long between deliveries. I've seen bakeries in New York, for example, who can have two or three times a week a delivery, and their storage area ultimately can be a little bit slimmer than a bakery that is more rural and just has a delivery once a week. The next area is going to be the scaling and mixing. That is, of course, where everything kind of happens, where all the ingredients come together and you're producing a batter or a dough of some type for production. In the scaling and mixing area, we do anticipate to keep those items that have been open in this area. So, for example, of course, if a bag of flour is open, it's going to go into a bin. You'd probably want to have a flour bin for a minimum 50 pounds if you're a small bakery, but certainly if you're a bigger bakery, it might take 150 pounds or more. Just depends on how you go about your scaling and the amount of throughput that you have. In my micro bakery, I had a flour bin that could hold about 150 pounds. And what I'd like to do is keep it about half full in case I needed to reverse scale. If I needed 45 pounds of flour, then I could put the whole bag on the scale, take 5 pounds away. That would go back in my bin there. But ultimately, if you have an open package, that needs to stay in the scaling and mixing area. So, for example, if you break into a box of raisins and you are using those throughout the week, then you'll have the open box in your scaling and mixing area. And the backup box that's never been open is where it is kept in the storage area. So, the bulk fermentation area is the next one. I see a lot of people miss that. If you're producing any amounts of bread at all, then you need to consider where you're going to ferment that. It needs to be easily accessible, but out of the way. And oftentimes that is kind of a room that's set aside or a space that's set aside that has more stable temperature and that you could be able to get to those bins and fold that dough. Dividing and shaping is the next one. That would also be considered makeup in pastry area. So it's kind of self-explanatory, but ultimately we want a main workbench in most bakeries, and sometimes it's surrounded by ancillary equipment such as hydraulic dividers and bread molders. If it's even a bigger bakery, it could have a bread line in that area along with a bench. I see that as well. But we need to make sure that we have access for employees and racks to approach those areas and proper pathways. I like to give about 3 feet around the bench for people to move and a rack to pass through. And then the ends are often left open for that ancillary equipment, such as hydraulic dividers or a baguette molder or another piece of equipment to roll in to be able to use and then roll back out, that type of thing. Sometimes it's a reversible sheeter even. Then let's move on to proofing and retarding. Again, self-explanatory, but an area for proofing. If you're floor proofing, make sure that you leave a spot for that. I see a lot of times that bakeries will put a proof box in, but then they don't leave like an aisle for floor proofing. And as you know, as a baker, then not everything needs to go into the proof box. Many things will set outside or they'll be in the proof box for a period of time, but then come back out onto the floor to get a little bit of a skin or dry off some of the humidity before scoring and baking. So keep that in mind. The Also, the retarding side, you'll have to calculate ultimately how many racks you need to store if you are retarding. Let's say you're doing overnight sourdough or you're doing viennoiserie that's often going in and out of the walk-in. So you need to calculate for the amount of racks you anticipate to make. And don't just guess at the size of your retarder or your walk-in. It really does come down to how much you plan to produce. And if that's really everything is going in there, then it's going to be larger than someone who is direct baking on the same day. If they're focusing on baguettes or ciabatta and things like that, that are just mixed and produced throughout one shift and baked on the same day, then walk-in maybe not as big. But if you're doing overnight sourdough, you really do need to do some calculations there. So next on the list is baking. Again, we all have an idea of what that looks like. But if you're designing a bakery, please keep in mind the approach to the oven and the exit from the oven with the baked product. Because I see a lot of times, for example, that a rack oven would be placed near the deck oven or possibly a proof box, and that when the rack oven is open, it kind of becomes this traffic jam with the rack coming out of baked product that you're trying to approach with new product, and possibly even another baker is working another station, such as a deck oven right next to it. And there's a possibility of somebody getting burned if it's not planned correctly, or the doors are not opening the correct way for the approach. There's a big difference if the deck oven's on the left and you open and the heat flows towards that deck oven, as opposed to if the door opens the other way, then the heat is blasting out the other direction. And the baker on the deck oven not getting a repeated blast of hot air throughout his shift. So something to think about there. The next area is cooling, which is, of course, very important and often left off. I do like deck oven baking to have a dedicated mobile cooling rack designed into the space next to the oven, often one that's parallel with the oven and another one that's pulled out that you can load and then send off to the cooling department. So think about cooling starts with unloading properly, and then that rack is removed from the production space to another location. So cooling and packaging often take up about 20-25% of a bakery space. And it sounds pretty huge, but ultimately you're baking everything for your day for a direct store delivery type of situation, and it's being housed in one area together, and it really puts a strain on the bakery if it's not planned properly to where you have a place to go put that bread or pastry to cool properly before it heads off into the packaging. And yes, the next area is packaging. You'll need to make sure that you have allocated enough space for your bags. And again, this kind of is the same as the scaling area. You'll have open boxes that you're currently using, and maybe even one backup on the table below or on shelves. And then the bulk of those backup bags that have never been opened are back in storage where they belong. But you need to have a space to keep open boxes, labels if you're labeling, or if you're stamping bags, or however your approach is on that. That has to be thought about for that space. You also have bread slicers in that area and many other things. So packaging can take up to 20-25% of the space. Let's talk about a couple other areas that aren't necessarily production, so they really don't fall into the calculation of production square footage, but they are important if you're designing a bakery, and that would be employee areas. I think it's very important to consider if your employees are going to have a break inside the building, or are they outside. If you're in a southern climate in California or Arizona, there's parts of the year that they easily can go out and sit on picnic tables and take a break and stuff like that. Or if it's inclement weather or too hot in that area or too cold, then ultimately are they taking a break in the retail area? How is that done? And so consider that. Are you adding a break room? And then another very important area that you have to consider is employee storage areas or lockers because many people are taking the bus or Ubers and they're not necessarily driving. And when they arrive at work, they have their coat and their bags and things of that nature. And those will go somewhere. They might end up under the front counter in the retail area, or they might just be stuffed in the storage area on top of flour. I think it's best to allocate areas, and if you can, give them a small locker or a safe place to put their items so they can prepare for work properly and go do their job. So, addition to the employee areas, we have the dish room, which is vitally important. That needs to be centrally located. It's sometimes challenging to find the correct spot for it in a bakery. And so you have to become creative in your approach on the dish room. Now I know that sometimes you're forced with an existing floor drains and a dish room. So if you're leasing a building that's already established and you are trying to cut costs, you might just accept what you already have available for you there. But if you have a chance, it's often nice to have it centrally located between a pastry and bread production, depending on the size of your building. There's also the thought about returning trucks, bringing back bins that possibly need washed, and how you're going to deal with that as well. So, is the dish room just responsible for taking care of bread and pastry? Is it responsible for taking care of the front of the house as well, with possible plates and silverware or flatware? Also, does it have to support the trucks returning with bins? I've worked at bakeries where they had dedicated pastry bins, and so they would take them out, drop them off. They would be picked up and returned. And if they weren't washed, they started to smell sour. Those definitely had to be cleaned on a daily basis as well. That's something else to consider. All right, so that is our production areas that we need to consider when designing a bakery. So let's move on to the pounds of product per square foot that a bakery can anticipate making. Before we size any equipment, we need to clarify how much your bakery can realistically produce. In earlier parts of this series, we introduced the concept of pounds of dough per square foot, and now we're going to put that into practical use. These numbers drive every decision you'll make about equipment, workflow, utilities, and staffing. There are two numbers that matter: 1 pound of dough per square foot, which is your sustainable daily production. This is the volume that your bakery should be comfortably producing on a normal day. It represents the amount of dough you can handle with a manageable workload. It's a predictable rhythm and a reasonable day for you and your team. For many bakeries, this level of production fits into a 10 to 12-hour workday, though in some cases it may stretch to 14 to 16 hours during the startup or staffing shortages. That's acceptable, but not ideal. The key is to design your space and choose your equipment so you do not depend on a 16-hour day to hit your normal production numbers. 1.3 pounds of dough per square foot, which is your maximum push. This is the absolute upper limit of what your space can produce in a 24-hour cycle. It's not your daily goal and not your baseline. It's the holiday stretch, the capacity you reach during Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, or other major wholesale surges. Hitting the 1.3 number requires starting earlier, baking later, and adding more hands and filling every inch of the walk-in and rack space. It's intense but doable because your bakery will be designed for it. Why this distinction matters: your equipment should be sized around the sustainable number of 1 pound per square foot because that is how you will operate 95% of the time. When your regular day is sized correctly, everything feels smooth, efficient, and manageable. You have enough space at each workflow stage. The extra 0.33 pounds is simply headroom. You use it only when the calendar demands it. It's the margin that keeps your bakery profitable during peak weeks without requiring you to buy oversized equipment or run exhausting daily shifts. In short, design your bakery for the 1 pound of square foot for a sustainable day and use the 1.3 pounds per square foot capacity for holiday surges and special events. This approach allows you to grow steadily, protect your labor, and build a production system that can flex when needed but never overwhelms you on a normal Tuesday in March. So in short, the 1.3 pounds per square foot would be about the maximum a bakery could withstand, even on a busiest day. I've been to a lot of bakeries around the United States and in Europe, and that is their high-end number. And I often have seen that in bakeries that are bursting out the seams and needing to expand to a new location. They are landing at 1.27, 1.3, 1.32 pounds per square foot, and there's just no room. Their labor is high because of production, and it's just unsustainable ultimately. So they're looking to maybe offload pastry into another location or move bread to another location, or just in general somehow get that number back under control. Sales are good, but they need to be profitable sales. Labor is typically high if you're running at 1.3 pounds per square foot in any bakery, just because you're moving racks to get to a work table, and you're waiting, or employees are waiting for the benches to be cleared from one product so they can start the next product. Just in general, labor is going to be higher, and that's why you do not want to run at those extreme numbers. The 1 pound per square foot typically is a profitable bakery if it's managed well and labor is in check and they're able to complete the daily tasks without running overtime. And in general, it's a comfortable, steady, but busy pace. When a bakery is looking to get open or start or possibly move to a new location, I always recommend that they start around zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.6 pounds per square foot. I want them to get to that number within the first year, or else they simply have chosen the wrong size of space. If they get there way faster, then they probably have opened or started in too small of a space. And if it takes them longer than the 6 months to a year window to get to zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.6 pounds, then clearly they've overestimated their market and they're not producing enough product really to pay for the space. So ultimately, once we've kind of figured out what the bakery should be producing, then we can begin to size the equipment accordingly to the space. So if you think about it, you want to be able to size your rack ovens and deck ovens to the amount that you potentially could make in a maximum capacity situation. And so if you know that you could make 1,000 pounds of product and your products are primarily bread and pastry, and bread takes up 70 or 80% of the space, 20% is viennoiserie or some other pastry, then you know that you can size your oven for, let's say, 800 pounds of product. The calculation is very simple. You can just look at how many pounds of dough per square meter you can bake in a deck oven and arrive at how many hours it would take to produce that. I can tell you that I use the number 18 pounds of product per square meter per hour. That's another number to kind of jot down and keep in your notes as I've kind of tossed these out to you today. So let me throw a couple numbers at you. Let's say you wanted to bake 500 pounds of product in a deck oven. Divide that by how many hours you would like it to be done in. So let's say 5 hours. That seems to be a reasonable number for someone to run a deck oven in this hypothetical medium to small bakery. So that would be 100 pounds an hour that you want to bake. I use the number 18 pounds per square meter per hour. Why 18? It's because it's a real world number. A lot of manufacturers will tell you it's 20 pounds or 25 pounds that they say that you could bake. And I assume that that's in a best case scenario. If you're to bake all 1 kilo loaves and just load it time after time with the same shape, it's really maximizing the deck. But that's just not real world. Maybe it is for you, but most bakeries have a variety of products and a variety of sizes. They'll have baguettes, they'll have ciabatta paninis, and they're going to have some type of roll. There might be some large loaves that are 1 kilo. Then there might be some bowls and soup bowls. So a variety of sizes, right? In my experience, a comfortable number is 18 pounds of product can bake per square meter per hour. So if you did 500 pounds in 5 hours, that's 100 pounds of product per hour. Divide that by 18. That gives you 5.5 square meters of surface that you need to be able to bake that 100 pounds an hour, ultimately 500 pounds in 5 hours. So then if you want to play with that number a little bit differently, I would change the hours, because if I was a sole baker in a bakery and I had to mix, shape, and bake everything, I might want that number to be 3 hours, which I did in my micro bakery that I had a few years ago. I kind of oversized my oven, so I put that down around 3 hours because I wanted to bake out before a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. I didn't want it to take 5 hours to bake all of that product. So I ended up kind of oversizing it because I chose the number 3 hours instead of 5. That gave me like a 7.5 square meter oven. So that's how you would size that. On rack ovens, you would really size it per pan and per rack. And so if you just open up an Excel spreadsheet and say that you have 80 pans a day that you need to produce, 40 of them are croissants, and you can get 12 pans per rack in the oven, then you can do the math there. If it's pan breads or something or stolen for the holidays, then you'll be able to say, maybe I'm only getting 10, maybe 8 pans, just depends on what size of rack oven you have, and just do a little bit of a calculation to ultimately pick that number, or pick that size of oven that you need, or how many ovens that you might need. So these are just the steps, really. It's just math. But it all starts with how much can you produce in that space ultimately, and then you can kind of work back. Now, you might not buy all of the equipment up front. For example, you might start with a modular electric deck oven that can bake everything because you're sizing your equipment in the beginning for just the 0.5 or 0.6 pounds per square foot, but ultimately know that you might have to replace that oven or upgrade it to a bigger size when you start to hit that 1 pound and 1.3 pounds per square foot. I see this come into play when a wholesale bakery is opening, and let's say they go into a 10,000 square foot production area, and they're moving in with only a half a pound per square foot of production because they're leaving room for growth, because maybe they're opening more bakery cafes and whatnot. So maybe they put in a nice large deck oven, but then only buy one rack oven in the beginning. But the bakery is designed to take another rack oven at a future date when the business gets to that point. But they've drawn it in and spec'd it in. So as soon as they're ready and they hit 0.7, maybe that's the break point that they need to add the second rack oven and possibly a third rack oven in a space of that size of 10,000 square feet. Might take 3 rack ovens to hit that capacity of 13,000 pounds in a day on some future holiday, right? So, but not everything has to be purchased right up front. Oftentimes it's not a luxury that small bakeries have, because they kind of just buy once and they size it for the future. So it just depends on if you're opening a wholesale bakery or a retail bakery, on whether or not you're going to buy an oven for your maximum capacity up front or not. But it allows you to make that decision knowing that you might start with something used or something a little bit more affordable, but know that you're going to upgrade that piece if it ultimately doesn't calculate out or compute out. So anyway, hopefully that number makes sense. If it does not, please reach out and ask me to clarify. I would love to know what everybody's producing this holiday week per square foot in your production space. If people want to drop that into the comments, that would be very interesting to see if people feel busy at 0.9, or did somebody miraculously achieve the 1.4 or 1.5 pounds per square foot. But hey, remember, all of that has to be done in your space, meaning you have to have your ingredients in-house and everything is produced all the way to the end in that space. And then that's what the number entails. Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody taking your time out of your day to watch our podcast, and I ask you to like this video. That helps a lot, and we'll look forward to seeing you in January 2026.